Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast, Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is another Saving Savvy episode. This time we're going to do a review of the bridge camera, the Panasonic LZ200. A bridge camera is basically a compact camera in a larger DSLR styled body, and its big defining feature is that it has a very long zoom lens. That zoom lens can be 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, and there are now some bridge cameras that actually have 50 time zoom lenses. So how do they do that? Well, let me show you. This is a 26 times zoom. This is a 600 millimeter zoom lens collapsed with the lens hood. I'll take off the lens hood to show you. That's what it looks like. If we turn it on and I zoom it all the way out, it's a little bit bigger. Not terribly big though. Just to give you a point of contrast, this is a 200 millimeter f2.8 zoom for a DSLR with the lens hood. I'll take the lens hood off to show you if I can. Why can I never do that? There we go. So that's without the lens hood. Here again, just to give you an idea, 600 millimeter equivalent, 200 millimeter DSLR lens. So the way that they do that is by using a smaller sensor. And because this sensor is considerably smaller than a sensor in a DSLR, you can have smaller lenses and the focal length can be shorter to achieve an equivalent of a very, very, very large zoom lens. So pretty amazing. And this is only a 24 times zoom. There are zooms that go up to 50 times. Big zooms are not always the answer that you're looking for, however. It sounds very impressive, but what happens oftentimes when you use a very long zoom, the longer it is, the harder it is to keep steady, even if it has optical image stabilization, which means your pictures can be blurry. The other thing, it's hard to track objects when that zoom is really long because you're really looking at a tiny object off in the distance. And the other thing that happens with these zoom lenses is, with the exception of this LZ200, most of these bridge type cameras, as the zoom lens goes further out, the actual aperture, the light kind of, the opening of the lens gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's due to cost reasons. So oftentimes when you see these super duper zoom lenses, they usually will show you what I call the eagle in the tree picture. And what that is that they'll take a relatively small object like an eagle, and it will be in a stationary position like hanging out in a tree, and it's not that far away, so you're not going through a lot of atmospheric kind of pollution and everything like that, so it looks really clear. And it's a bright day, so you have lots of light, because remember that aperture is getting smaller and smaller as you're going out. And they take this shot, probably with a tripod, and it looks just awesome. And you say to yourself, well, I want to take pictures of eagles in trees too, and maybe you do. But again, it's a very controlled situation. Many of us want our super zoom lenses to take pictures of, let's say, our kids in a school performance on a poorly lit auditorium stage, or maybe do some sports photography in a gym that's usually poorly lit. And when you try to do those types of pictures with a very small aperture, the only way that you can accomplish that is by pushing up the ISO, or the films, or the sensor sensitivity, which makes it noisy, or making the shutter stay open longer, which gives you a blurry picture, which is why this camera is so awesome, because it has a very fast f2.8 lens throughout its entire zoom range. It doesn't go down as you zoom out. It stays really wide open, and 2.8 is just a great aperture. In fact, that's the aperture on this professional grade Nikon. I'll tell you, this costs much more than this entire camera here. And it's a pretty sophisticated lens too, with like nano coating and spherical lenses and all sorts of other things inside to make it a high quality lens. So big zooms are great, but super duper duper zooms sound impressive, but they may not be as impressive as you think. So let me give you a practical example. So let's say I'm in a gym or an auditorium and I want to shoot some moving objects, kids on a stage or whatever. I could do this if I had the aperture and I'm zoomed all the way out at f2.8, a film speed of 400, which isn't too fast, and a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. No problem because I have that big aperture. Now let's say I go and instead I bring another actually favorite camera of mine. This is a Sony HX30V. This has a 20x zoom. When it's zoomed all the way out, that 20x, it has a 5.8 aperture. Remember, the bigger the number of the aperture, the smaller it is. So to use this all the way zoomed out, I'd have to have a ISO or a film speed of 1600 instead of 400. I could still shoot it at that 250th of a second. That's going to be pretty noisy and grainy. Or I can go the opposite way, keep the film speed at 400, but then I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second. Again, all that movement is going to be a blur. So that's the huge advantage of having this constant aperture on this particular camera, where when I zoom out, I just still have all this light coming in. So what do you get with this camera? First of all, it's an excellent camera. The build quality feels fine. It's a little bit plasticky. If you shake it a little bit, you can hear a bit of a rattle, but I contacted some other people that have the camera, and they said that that's normal for this camera, so that's okay. But you get all the bells and whistles that you would expect with a compact camera, with the exception of Wi-Fi. Although you certainly could probably use an iFi card or something like that. So what are some of the things you get? Well, you get intelligent auto, where the camera determines everything for you. Is it a sports shot, a landscape shot, a portrait shot? Just kind of put it on that setting and the computer in the camera figures it all out. You get special effects of all sorts, black and white, miniature effect, selective color, on and on and on. I'll show you some of those in a later video. You get panorama, which is a really nice function to have. You get in-camera photo editing. So if you want to reduce the size of the picture, or let's say you took a picture and now you want to convert it into black and white, you can do that in the camera, and other things too. You have a fully articulated, so the screen comes out, turns all the way around, does whatever you want it to do, screen that I think is about 480,000 dots per inch. Now that's very, very good for this type of camera. And in fact, you'd often find a screen of that resolution even on some higher end cameras, although they have been boosting their resolution. You get an electronic viewfinder, but it's not some cheesy electronic viewfinder. It's a 1.3 million dot electronic viewfinder, so things are going to look very accurate and crispy and clear when you look through the viewfinder. It has the ability to do all sorts of HD video, and although I haven't checked the video yet, I'm going to do that later today. I hear the video quality is very, very good. And it even has things like a microphone jack. So if you wanted to use an external microphone instead of the internal microphone, you could absolutely do that too. It has a lot of technology built into it that makes the most of its smaller sensor, which all these intelligent features like intelligent ISO and intelligent noise reduction and intelligent sharpening and all that. So you're really going to get the most out of a small sensor camera. What is it like, or how is it like a DSLR? Well, you have full manual controls. You can control the aperture, the shutter speed, or both together. You can control the ISO, and you have many ways to limit those things like you would have in a DSLR. There are lots of knobs and buttons, and in fact there are 3 separate buttons that you can program to do whatever you want them to do, so the camera suits your particular needs. You're not going to even find that level of control on a low-level DSLR. It does capture in RAW. All the shots that I will show in a later video will be in JPEG. I usually shoot in JPEG, but the advantage of RAW is if you're shooting in very low light or very difficult conditions, you have all of the data, and you can take that into a photo editor and really reduce the noise and get the best image possible. You have 4 customizable settings that you can kind of select from up here. So if you have a particular setting that you have customized for, oh, let's say macro or fireworks or something, that you don't like the setting that's in the camera, you can make your own, and it's always there just waiting for you. It has a larger battery, larger than what you're going to see in a typical compact camera, so you're going to get more shots like you would with a DSLR. It has where that mic little jack is right here. If you're in photo mode, you can buy a very inexpensive trigger and trigger the camera remotely, and that's great if you're doing work where you don't want to shake the camera at all, so it's a much more advanced feature. You can go into your menus and adjust all of the parameters to your liking. So it kind of comes out with a little bit softer colors, a little softer sharpness. If you don't like that, you can just go in the menu and turn up the sharpness for your photos, or turn up or turn down the color. Again, a more DSLR-like feature, something that you typically wouldn't see in a typical compact camera. It has a hot shoe, and with the hot shoe you can do all sorts of amazing things, like put a flash on here and get bounce flash. And bounce flash is a much softer flash, which is really great for portraits. It kind of gives you that professional look. What else did I say down here? You not only have exposure compensation, but you also have flash exposure compensation, so you can adjust the intensity of the flash. If it's too bright or not bright enough, you can kind of turn it up or down a bit and still let the computer in the camera do most of the work. You're just kind of doing a fine adjustment. And many, many other different sorts of things. So, is this a DSLR? No, for 2 reasons. One, it does not have an optical viewfinder. It has this awesome electronic viewfinder. The other thing is that it has a sensor that's the size of a compact camera, not the much, much larger sensor that you would see in a DSLR. So what's the advantage of a larger sensor? So let's say this sheet represented the sensor size of a DSLR. The sensor of a compact camera would be more like this big, so much smaller. Now if you put 10 million pixels or 10 megapixels on each of those sensors, just logically the sensors on this big sheet would be much larger. Larger sensors gather better light, and that gives you 2 great things. One, you have greater dynamic range. That means the difference between absolute black and absolute white, there's a lot of more gradations in between, so that will give your photos a somewhat more realistic look. The other thing is, because those sensors are so much bigger on the big chip, or this piece of paper, as we're talking about here, is that they gather light better, and they perform better in low light because they gather more light. So big chip cameras tend to perform better at higher ISOs. They have less noise, they're sharper, they're clearer, and so that's a great advantage, and that's why professionals tend to use the big sensor cameras. The other thing that you'll sometimes hear is people will say that big sensor cameras have better bokeh or bokeh, and that's the blurred background. So if we had good, I'm using a little webcam here, but if we had a great camera and my background would be all blurred out, but I'd be sharp, that would be a narrow depth of field. That's bokeh. That back would be nice and blurry. But that's really not true. It's just that bigger sensors contribute to that effect, because the 2 things that cause good bokeh, one is the wideness of the lens. The bigger the aperture, in other words, the lower the f number, the shallower the depth of field, so you get that blurred background. And the longer the focal length of the lens, the better the bokeh. So if you combine a big aperture with a long focal length, you're going to have great bokeh. Now, this camera, because it has a small sensor, even when you're magnified pretty far out, doesn't have a very long focal length, where a DSLR, again here, has a huge, look how long this guy is, has a long focal length, and that's what really gives you the bokeh. So who is this camera intended for? I think with this sophisticated sort of setup and the super fast lens, it's intended for a lot of people. First of all, if you're just a point and shooter, you're getting an awesome camera that has tons of completely automatic settings, but you're also getting a big zoom, but that really enormously bright lens, which is no other camera of this type has that. It's not a 50x zoom, but remember, long zoom is not necessarily the best thing from what I've told you earlier. So it also has that little articulated screen and everything else, so you can go to town producing great pictures with very little effort. But there are so many manual controls and things like a jack for a shutter release and a hot shoe and all sorts of customizable controls within the menu that this camera is also very suitable for the hobbyist and even the enthusiast, because you can do just about any type of photography that you could think of, from macro photography to wildlife or sports photography, portrait photography, anything really with this camera, because it's so flexible and it has this really great bright lens on it. Who is this camera not for? Well, obviously, if you are a professional and you're doing magazine covers or professional, let's say, fashion shoots, you want the absolute best quality pictures that you can get, and you're going to want a DSLR. Also, if you're just an amateur and you want the absolute best quality, this might be a nice camera to have in your bag as a secondary camera, just because it's so good. Now, the last question I kind of want to address is, how much of a difference would you see from a photograph from, let's say, a bridge camera versus, let's say, a DSLR or a large sensor camera? Yes, you indeed would see a difference. But if you're posting mostly to social networking sites like Facebook, you're not going to see much of a difference, just because everything's compressed anyway, in most cases. In fact, if you don't believe me, I did a whole video on it. Just click on that link and you can take a test and see if you can tell the difference. If you're making very large prints, you may see a difference if you closely inspect the pictures, but probably not if you're just casually looking at them. So the reality is, compact type sensors have gotten so advanced, and especially one in a camera like this, that they take awesome pictures. Now, how is this sensor different from, let's say, a sensor in a cheaper compact camera? Well, what they've done is a couple of things. One thing is that they took all the electronic circuitry and put that circuitry behind the photo sites. So they're not going to be blocking the photo sites, and you'll be getting more light sensitivity. The other thing that they did was, instead of cramming as many pixels on here as they possibly could, they kept the number down to a reasonable 12 megapixels. And that means that each of those photo sites are just a little bit bigger, and you're going to get a better picture because of it. Tons and tons of megapixels no longer means a better picture. In fact, sometimes it worsens the picture. And then the third thing they did was they combined it with a very sophisticated processor that can do things like intelligently remove noise or intelligently sharpen parts of the picture, just something that you couldn't even do probably 5 or 6 years ago. So I would highly recommend this camera. I think it's great for the snap shooter or the hobbyist or even the enthusiast. It's not quite at the level of a DSLR as far as image quality, but as far as functionality, it really sort of is there. So if you get some time, please give my podcast a listen. It's called Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike. It's on iTunes, and I will be having 2 more videos that I'm producing right now. One will be a bunch of different shots taken with the LZ200, and the last one will be a low light performance test, looking at how good the video is on the LZ200. Take care and have a great day.